So as I mentioned, Indivisible Berkeley's economic justice team was really fortunate. In fact, we were sort of struggling because we were a relatively small team and figuring out how do we have sort of the capacity to do all the actions that we want to do. And we were really fortunate to engage with our two next speakers, and they really helped revitalize us. One is Sandy Emerson, who really put this on, and David Ellison as well. So, Sandy Emerson is a retired software executive and heads the Move Your Money campaign for fossil-free California. Inspired by divestment pledges made for the 2014 People's Climate March, Sandy has been giving presentations on why and how to divest a personal portfolio from fossil fuels, and how to move your money out of polluting banks and credit cards, and how to begin exploring investments in clean energy technologies. As a personal divestment evangelist, Sandy believes in the power of individuals to move markets away from fossil fuels and other unhealthy investments in order to make way for a world of clean energy in a peace economy.
When I became involved with divestment, I had a portfolio which was sort of an accident of capitalism. I joined a startup that started up and continued, and I ended up with a portfolio of various things. And I took a look at some of those. I was horrified to find that I was invested in Keystone XL. I was invested in this, that, and the other thing. But during the process of working through those investments, I never changed my banks. I never thought about my banking. With the indigenous-led activism around Dakota Access Pipeline, it became clear that anyone with a banking relationship can make a difference by moving their money out of polluting banks. We all know that investments in fossil fuel companies will become worthless, but why wait for that to happen? You can move your money now and help render the transition that much faster. The fossil fuel companies depend on the valuation of their reserves to make themselves look like a going concern. And they depend on capital expenditures for exploring for new sources of oil, extreme fuels, and dirty fuels everywhere to make themselves look like a going concern. Exxon, for a brief period in 2016 or something, moved out of funding new capital projects, and the share prices dropped because the belief system of the market is that you have to continue to grow and grow and grow and drill and expand and relentlessly pursue new sources of reserves. As you know, 80% of these reserves have to stay in the ground if we are to avoid catastrophic climate warming. The actions started by the Defund Apple movement amplified bank activism. It really began with the crash of 2008, when it became clear what bad actors banks are and how little they care about the welfare of their customers. During the Occupy movement in 2011, there were also bank exits. But the Dakota Access Pipeline movement and the data that accompanied it, the wonderful volunteer-led research that exposed how the banks and how the project managers of those banks are connected to the pipeline projects. That's what really started this landslide of bank exits. The total, as Alex pointed out, is some $15 billion so far and counting. There are so many reasons to break up with megabanks. They invest in pipelines and prisons and nukes, and not to mention fossil fuels, all the name brands. 25 megabanks invested $785 billion in damaging fossil fuels from 2013 to 2015. The Rainforest Action Network is one of these great data centers that pulls all this stuff together. They do a report every year on bank investments and how carbon project financing is going. There was a sort of dip in bank financing for fossil fuel projects in the run-up to the Paris Climate Accord. But once we got past that, and of course once Trump pulled out, the financing resumed, even for coal. Who would invest in coal? But the banks are forming this part of a belief system that is purely fictitious. It doesn't have any strength except the perceptions of people who continue to invest. So Food and Water Watch and Rainforest Action Network did connect the dots. I understand, David Elliston, that you asked Bank of America during that time when you became activated by Dakota Access Pipeline. You said, so are you funding the Dakota Access Pipeline? And I understand that they said, no, we're not funding the pipeline. Well, they're funding the project company that funds the pipeline. There's a wonderful data guy, I think he's in Seattle, who makes all of these connections clear little by little. It's a very tangled web, how all these companies are structured and their ownership, and it all sort of feeds into the project itself. Energy Transfer Partners, you may have heard that name. It's the project manager company, and it is currently suing Greenpeace, among others, for interfering with its business. We'll see how that goes. So, do bank actions count? Yes, they do. The CEOs of banks and the CEOs of project management firms pay attention, and they even get annoyed enough to file baseless lawsuits. In all, 35 banks funded directly or indirectly the Dakota Access Pipeline. All the name brands, you can see their logos here. When you're thinking about where you put your money, you are thinking about, is your money aligned with your values? You know that money talks, so what is your money saying about you? And it is your money. About 45% of the $17.3 trillion in deposits are controlled by the 4 largest banks. So start at the top, divest from them. In all, individual households own about 80% of the $30 trillion equity market, 38% directly. And it's your money. And it's our money. 11 trillion of these assets are controlled by women. The first thing you want to know when you're changing your banking relationship is, so where do I move my money? Credit unions, as has been pointed out, are a good bet. There are socially responsible banks. There are community financial development institutions, which are a specialized type of bank that invest in low-income communities and community projects. Look for a bank like Beneficial State Bank that's a B Corp, which is, required and has signed up and is certified to reinvest in the community. Your local banks may have local investments mainly centering around vehicles and real estate rather than pipelines and prisons. The mega banks, some of them invest a lot in community projects. It's part of, polishing their image. And look what Wells Fargo is trying to do with its reinvention campaign. Their share price got really hammered by all the scandals. It's sort of plateauing. But the mega banks are operating globally, and they may assert that they are removing funding from pipeline projects or extreme fuel projects, but it bears watching. There's a wonderful website called bankstalking.org that reads the, security filings and gets way down into the details. And usually if a bank says, like U.S. Bank, no, we're not going to do any more such and such projects, it turns out that another arm of U.S. Bank will have extended a line of credit for these same projects. So get away from the mega banks. There are lots of other options. Credit unions are pervasive. They are extremely accepting. They have more free ATMs than big banks. And there are good research tools like banklocal.info where you can type in your town name or your zip code. You will get a list of banks within a geographical radius, and then you can get a report card on an individual bank. The site NerdWallet has a good list of banks, and Green America has a deep list of resources, including lists of socially responsible banks. The recipe for moving your checkings and savings account was put out by the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau years ago. It's repeated and repeated, this list of steps. But obviously, you open a new account before you close your other account. You make sure that all your direct deposit and automatic payments have been moved over. But the most important step when you close your big bank account is to write a letter to the CEO of that bank and say why you're closing your account, and put a copy on file with your local bank as well. The CEO may very well send you a direct communication. It happens. I've heard it. But the most important part is how you feel once you have summoned your resolve and you have moved your money and stated so in writing. During bank actions, it's often possible to take this action with others, to do your closing of your account as part of a bank action. That's particularly effective. And don't forget about your credit cards. You need to open clean credit cards because the processors, Visa, Discover, MasterCard, whatever, are affiliated quite often with the mega banks. Speaking personally, I had a serious addiction to my Chase Mileage Plus Explorer, but I changed. There are responsible credit cards. If you bank with a different bank, they may offer a credit card, and so there you are. There are a lot of affinity cards available from TCM Bank, which is a mild-mannered, a clean investing bank that sponsors cards for Amazon Watch, for Green America, and others. And interestingly, one of my main affinities, REI, offers a credit card from U.S. Bank, so that's no good. When you're moving your money, you think, okay, so I've moved my so many dollars. Does this have an effect? But some researchers charted a decline in new deposits after no DAPL activism, and the top darker areas changed to lighter areas when new deposits declined. As Alex said, they lost billions of dollars. There have been many cities that take bank divestment resolutions, Seattle and San Francisco among them. It's effective, of course, when cities take resolutions because that's big bucks, but each individual resolution is important too. The other side of the equation, which I will introduce before David shows you how to see what's in your portfolio, is fossil fuel divestment. I became energized by the 2014 People's Climate March when the Rockefeller Brothers Fund divested from fossil fuels. I thought if the heirs to an oil fortune would divest from fossil fuels, then what was I waiting for? And I wanted to teach other people how to divest their portfolios, and the most important thing is being able to find out what's in there. For years, I was a passive investor. I had no idea. The first step in this process is to set your intention. There's a group called divestinvest.org that takes individual pledges. You pledge not to invest in the Carbon Underground 200. You pledge to sell your current investments and reinvest in the new energy economy. It's really important to set your intention. The divestinvest.org, like Mazaska Talks, is accumulating these pledges, and as of this date, Divestinvest has identified worldwide from individuals and institutions a total of $6.3 trillion assets under management that have been pledged to divest. It all adds up. It's adding up in a spectacular way. The divestment movement is one of the fastest growing social movements of this century. You should also think about your 401k, and you should educate your advisor. That's often a very important step. Cities have done fossil fuel divestments. We had a lovely pledge from New York City in December saying that they would divest their 5 common retirement funds to the tune of $5.2 billion. The World Bank has signed on. The Norway Sovereign Wealth Fund has signed on. This is when their sovereign wealth comes from oil. The Statoil company, in fact, in Norway, is rebranding itself to get oil out of its name. The entire country of Ireland has pledged to divest from fossil fuels, and Senator Jeff Merkley of Oregon has just introduced a bill that would divest one part of the civil service funds, so divest the feds. Lots of cities have divested. Yesterday, divestinvest.org announced a Divest Cities campaign, so these municipal resolutions are going to keep coming in and keep adding up. There is statistical evidence as well that divestment announcements depress share prices. The red dips below are where share prices fell below what would have been expected following divestment announcements. Not only that, but the world of socially responsible investing is growing fast. You no longer have to assume that if you're going to be socially responsible that you may lose money. Socially responsible investing has grown 33% in the last few years, represents $8.72 trillion of assets under management out of $40 trillion total, and the performance regularly exceeds, the performance of traditional funds. As You Sow just published a report. It's interesting because As You Sow has focused on engagement with fossil fuel companies, but this could be changing. They reported some data from Corporate Knights that New York would have been $15 billion richer if it had divested from fossil fuels in the last 10 years. And the state of Massachusetts would have been $3 billion richer if it had divested from fossil fuels. So it pays to divest. I encourage you to move your money, and divestment works. Thank you.